Um, okay, I need your help before we get started, which is I need to. I was hoping to share a video clip with you guys that has that has sound, and I need to know if you can hear it. If not,
Hi,
we're
Sabina.
gonna skip it. Alrighty.
Hi, Sabina.
Can you hear
Hi.
this?
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen you. Yeah, it's great to see you. And
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. You can hear it. I'm not a total idiot. Great. Okay. Alrighty. Alrighty. Here we go, folks. Everything's good. And welcome to your Sunday. I always find it miraculous that so many people join. Um, but I guess that's just MCAT prep, right? You show up on a Sunday morning. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you so much for not being super shocked by the switch with Josh's lecture and mine. I appreciate the flexibility. And that means that we have today's lecture, and then in a few days, we have another one. So we get a lot of psychology back to back. I hope that the other classes have treated you all right. Um, let's see. Yes, I have slides to share. Could anybody post the slides that I emailed about 15 minutes ago to you all? That would be really helpful. That way I don't have to leave this screen. Because I know. Alrighty, Sarai's got it. Bam, bam. Oh yeah. Okay, so Jonathan. We've talked about this. We've talked about how I don't have your right email. Jonathan, do me a favor and please email me at that email with the correct email. That's the absolute best way. I think otherwise, from last time, I think I had everybody's emails correct. So one-on-ones and office hours. So a few people have reached out to me to schedule one-on-ones to talk about specific questions, have mental breakdowns, etc. And I think that's a really great use of our time to have one-on-ones. And I'm totally game to have that. If you would like to schedule a time, email me and I generally can find time in the mornings or in the evenings. So that's the best way to go about it. You can let me know in the chat here too, but it's more likely that it'll slip in the barrage of messages. So send me an email if you would like to do that. Also, office hours for this class. I've nailed down a couple of days and windows that work for me, and I hope that one of them works for the majority of you. Tuesdays or Wednesdays, mornings or evenings. Is there so far any overwhelming preference for one of these? Alrighty. Okay. So far, Wednesday evening has come up, and that is great. That is great. Tentatively, let's do Wednesday evening as the office hour. And does it, do you have a class on Wednesday nights? Can you remind me? Yes, you do. You have a class at 7, 2 to 4? Really? 5 to 7 Eastern. Okay. What is 5 to 7? That's 2 to 4. Okay. Alrighty. Thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, perfect. So my proposition would be so 7, I'm guessing now that some of you are Eastern, so 7 p.m. Pacific would be super late. Or would it? Is 10 p.m. like atrocious? Probably. How about 9 p.m.? Are those in the Eastern time? Tiffany, you are so, thank you so much. That is perfect. Yeah, I agree, Sophie. All right. Let's try to go for 8 p.m. Eastern time, excuse me. Which is what the hell is that? 5 PST. Um on Wednesdays. If what I just said does not work for you, um, please message me and let's have one-on-ones. Let's do that instead. Okay. And then yeah, that'll be good because hopefully you will have started encountering some questions in PsychSoc so that we could work on those. And as well as cover some extra material that we won't be able to cover today that I still think you should know for the MCAT quite well. Alrighty, so let's continue on. So what we're going to talk about today is cognitive psychology. Well, we call it cognitive psychology in the Berkeley Review. However, it is quite a monster of a topic to cover. In fact, cognition shows up in almost every aspect of psychology. So one way to go about it is by thinking of this lecture having the goal in a future where we would have 5-hour lectures to go over the topics that are listed here, 1 through 5. The ones that are highlighted in blue, we will not get to talk about today. They're very important, and I'll go into greater detail at the end as to the certain topics that that we won't talk about today, but that either in office hours or in your own study, you should definitely cover on your own. Alrighty. But of course, we can't start talking about cognition without talking about a blue watermelon. That couldn't be possible. I can't remember who it was that was harassing me so much about this, but here's a recap of what we were talking about last time. Last time we were talking about sensation and perception. Tiffany, yes, I certainly can. And we'll talk about that at the end. The last time we were talking about sensation and perception, and when we talked about the ways that we perceive color, we came upon 2 theories, the trichromatic theory of color. And do you remember the other one? Component process theory, question mark, correct. And the one that caused some confusion for me, and by extension you, was the trichromatic theory of color. So that, just as a recap, it talks that the theory is that we have these sensors. Remember, these theories were created in the 1800s before we really knew about neurons. But through observations, a couple of scientists came up with this idea that we have sensors that detect red, green, and blue. And any color that we see that isn't exactly that, it's a combination of those 3 colors. And there is support for this that we later discovered because of color blindness, because it seems that the major factors of color blindness, or excuse me, the major forms of color blindness are red, green, and blue color blindness. And so that was a piece of evidence for that. But then a challenge for that was this blue watermelon. So I wish I had some really crazy statement to say about it, but there was nothing more complicated than me getting confused as to the fact that trichromatic theory of color cannot explain why the after images occur. So in fact, opponent process theory can explain it, because opponent process theory proposes that we have opposing colors that, while one stimulates the neurons, it, on the other hand, inhibits the neurons of an opposing color. So the blue watermelon is proof that the opponent process theory works, while it is a challenge for the trichromatic theory because it cannot explain why the after images happen. It's just not within the scope of the theory. So that is why it proves to be incomplete. So I hope that answers that question. All right, so let's move on to today. Yeah, so thank you for asking, Michaela. The after image was, if you remember, I was asking you all to stare at the X of this blue watermelon for a certain period of time. And then I erased the blue watermelon from the screen. But hopefully, if you were very intent at looking at that cross, you would have seen the after images of the real colors of a watermelon, meaning like the red fleshy part and the green skin. Oh, mobile devices. Yeah. So if you're in your bed watching from your cell phone, that might be hard. All right. So yeah, a question in the chat is the after images are is just an effect that takes place. And it happens that that effect is support for the opponent process theory, because the opponent process theory says we see one color that's activated and inhibits another one. So that's exactly what's happening with the after effect. And the trichromatic theory does not account for that. So we're going to talk about paying attention. And this is a really important part to get us in our way to memory. So last time we were talking about sensation and perception, we talked about a couple of different things. We talked about how we have continual sensory input. Like, for example, you're looking at the screen and there's blue, there's a cute little stars in the font. And all of those things are part of the things that are hitting you in your visual stimuli. We also talked about auditory stimuli, which is in the form of sounds or even sometimes silence. And so we spoke about how those stimuli have particular pathways that get all the way from the stimulus to the sense of perception. Also important to remember is that when we talked about perception, we also talked about that we infer the reality that we see. We don't actually see everything that we think we see. What I mean by that is that we talked about, let me see, I'm going to quiz you. I gave you an example about a friend of yours that was meeting you for coffee, and that friend of yours was walking towards you. And visually, the stimulus that is hitting your retina is that that friend is increasing in size as the friend approaches you. But in reality, our brains interpret that to be that the person is simply getting close to you, not that their body is increasing in size. Do you remember the name of that process? I was like, hell no. Yeah, Michaela, it is size constancy. Exactly. We talked about size constancy, we talked about color, and we talked about form too. Exactly that one. So those are examples of how we actually infer reality. But now the idea is that we're going to turn to is attention. And so the idea is that this environment has a lot of information that is hitting your stimulus, yet the idea of attention is that you center your focus of cognition on one or a few different things. And so we choose to pay attention to certain things, but we're also going to look at the fact that when we do that, we become oblivious to the other things, right? So if we choose to focus on our imagination on the friends walking towards us, we might have totally become oblivious to the stop signs around or the cars parked on the street. And then, yeah, we'll talk about how in divided attention, we can't do everything all at once. And that one will actually be a little bit easier than selective attention. So the first part of selective attention is just setting up a framework here so that we can talk about these terms. The one, obviously, selective attention, I've put a definition right there. You don't really need to know the definition as much as just kind of understand that it's the ability to focus on something. So it's the conscious awareness that you're placing on a particular object or a stimulus. And then the other thing that you need to know about this is that it requires attentional resources. So it doesn't come free. And that's why I like the phrasing paying attention, because it tells you that you have a certain finite amount of resources and that in order to pay attention, you have to pay something. We've all experienced this when we're paying really hard attention to the lecture, but in about an hour and 58 minutes, you will have run out of a lot of that. So your attention will begin to diminish and diminish. And the way that we talk about these resources is cognitive resources. You don't really need to know that, but you just, exactly like currency. Um, you don't need to know cognitive resources, but just be aware of the term so when it comes up, it doesn't surprise you. Another term is cognitive load, which is just a kind of measurement of how many resources are required to carry out a task. The cognitive load, to say paying attention to, I don't know, the sound of a bird outside might be lighter than the cognitive load of paying attention to an MCAT test and difficult multiple choices. Automatic tasks use fewer resources. So that's kind of a little bit of an obvious one, but good to keep in mind that something that is simpler or automatic uses less, and that's why your attentional resources don't become as fatigued. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Okay. I need somebody. I need somebody. I can't see your names, but I need a volunteer to unmute themselves. I know this is so unheard of. People unmuting themselves. What? I need one. Tiffany, coming to the rescue. All righty, Tiffany. So here's your deal. You have a task that you have to do. I'm going to ask you to look at the following image, and you have to tell me as fast as you can the colors that you see, not the words.
Okay, I want to start from the top left corner then.
Yes, please.
Red, blue, orange, purple, orange, blue, green, red, green, red, purple, blue, 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 red, green, orange. Yeah.
Awesome. You don't have to continue. Thank you so much. Squinting helps. Yes, there's a reason why squinting helps, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Tiffany. If I could, I would give you 132 in Psych Social and MCAT. So what Tiffany did was actually much better than most people do, I'll have to say. There's a couple of ways that we can measure selective attention. One of them is called the Stroop task, which is this task right over here, which is, as Tiffany showed us, it's saying the color and not the word. So this is just an example of how you can measure selective attention because of the fact that as the task became more difficult, the attention began to get deteriorated. And so Tiffany began to say things a little bit more slowly. You don't have to remember this task for the MCAT, but it might pop up as an example. But the thing that you have to take away from this task is that as the attention gets exhausted, you can see that also the performance of it begins to get exhausted. Even though Tiffany, you did wonderfully, wonderfully. Another way of examining selective attention is dichotic listening. This one, you absolutely 100 million% will see a question on the MCAT. There's no doubt. There's no doubt in my mind. You're going to take it and you're going to say, like in an email, Diego, OMG, there was a question about dichotic listening. I should have listened. LOL. I included the definition for this one. It is so important for you to remember this task. I don't know why they're so obsessed with it, but it is pretty interesting. So the deal with dichotic listening is that it's a way to measure selective attention. And the way that they do that, particularly, what Tiffany just did was visual selective attention. And this one is auditory selective attention. In this task, a person is connected, as you can see in this diagram, with some headphones, and they're asked to do a task where they are listening to one of the sounds coming into the ears and ignore the other one. The way that that's called is that you have an attended channel. In the case of this diagram, it's the green channel, which is the left. Yeah, the left ear. And the unattended channel is the one in red on the right. This task is also called shadowing, and that's an important term for you to not forget. It's also the attended channel is also called the shadowed ear. You can think about shadowing, it's kind of a weird term until you really memorize it, but I like to think about shadowing as sort of echoing. So the idea is that you are echoing what you are hearing in one particular channel. So there's a couple of things you need to know about the dichotic listening task. It's a really interesting one that's been studied for over 50 years, and it's given rise to a lot of our ideas of memory. The shadow channel is the attended channel. Yes, that's right, Aditya. And it's been interesting because it's proven that people are fairly good about repeating with almost in complete accuracy what they're hearing in the attended channel. In fact, after doing several trials of the attended channel, people will generally pretty much not know anything that took place in the unattended channel, and they'll remember hearing most of the stuff of the attended channel. There's some things that they are able to tell about the unattended channel, though. So even though they can't remember the details of it, they can tell you if the unattended channel had human voice. They can tell you if the unattended channel had musical instruments, or if the unattended channel was silent. If it's a human voice that they can tell you that they heard in the unattended channel, they can tell you if it's male or female. They can tell you if it's loud or quiet, and they can tell you if it's a low or a high pitch. So all of these things that I've just said that you are able to detect in the unattended channel, even though you can't remember the meaning of it, are all physical properties of sound. So that's a really important thing to remember, is that the unattended channel, even though after several trials of this, most participants become oblivious to it, they're able to remember physical attributes of it, and specifically the ones I said. All righty. So there's an exception, of course. Some aspects of the unattended channel leak into the attended channel. And this is a really interesting pattern that takes place and that has been studied in multiple different ways. One of the ways that it's been studied in the dichotic listening task is that they were given in the shadowed ear, let's say they were asked to listen to something, whereas in the anything like a story, and then the unattended channel, they were given a series of names. So the person could say, yeah, I recognize that there was a human voice, that it was female and it was low. And then they can't remember any of the names. They can't remember that names were said even, they can just remember those physical properties. But suddenly in that unattended channel, the experimenters would throw in the name of the person listening. And then all of a sudden they did hear and remember hearing that name. Not only that, they also found that you could also remember, say, if you heard in the unattended channel your favorite movie, or the name of your ex, or the name of a friend. So there's this idea that some things actually do make their way into the unattended channel, into our register of what we're apparently supposed to be tuning out. Another way that it shows up is in the cocktail party effect. This is another one that you're going to see a question on the MCAT. I assure you, you're going to see. And it's a pretty fun one to remember. So it's not that bad. The cocktail party effect is basically, as this New Yorker over here shows, is that you're there dressed as a pirate and you're having a nice conversation with a dog. And so it's going great in your conversation, but then suddenly somewhere in the background, somebody says your name. And then suddenly your attention goes directly to the person saying that the conversation where your name came up, and you are suddenly oblivious at the conversation that you were just engaged in. This is an experience that I think some of us, or most of us, have experienced in some form. Say you're going to a busy, you don't have to actually go to a cocktail party. I don't know who goes to cocktail parties anymore. But say you're in a busy, crowded restaurant, and then you suddenly hear a name, and it disconnects you entirely from the thing that you were doing. This is kind of an extrapolation of the dichotic listening task that we see in everyday life, and something that you're definitely going to have to know for the MCAT. And yeah, this is just about catching attention, and it kind of leaves our conscious perception goes from the attended to the unattended stimuli. Alrighty, so let's watch this video. Now that I know that you can hear my sound, and then I'm going to ask you some questions after this video.
Hi, Sabina.
Hi.
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen you.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Andrea.
So how did you get here?
I took the subway from Middleton and it took only about half an hour.
Really? I drove from Gresham and it took 45 minutes.
Hooray for public transportation.
So why did you call me here for this mysterious meeting?
I'm planning a surprise party for Jerome and I need your help to keep him away from the house.
That's great. I'll do anything you need.
Good.
I hate surprise parties, but only when I'm the victim. Otherwise, they're great.
Very good.
Nope. Okay. All right. Other than how old the video obviously is, and just how bizarre the whole situation in this little gathering is, I certainly wouldn't want a party hosted by these two people. That's what I can say. Is what else did you notice about this video? Monica, did you really see that? That's very good. Did anybody see anything else? All righty. Okay. Okay, so this video has been used. Okay, gotcha. Well, hopefully some of you haven't seen this video. And right, Mo, it's not exactly, it's not the gorilla video, but this one is another video that looks at the breakdowns in selective attention. It turns out that this video actually showed so many different changes. I think over 10 different changes. Let's look, let me not play it, but take a peek at, let's start with the plates. They're red. Let's start, oh, actually, she's wearing, the lady in red is wearing a scarf. Now she isn't wearing a scarf. And then now there's food on the other plate, whereas it was first with the lady with the denim blouse or whatever that is. And then the plates became white. The plates became white. None of y'all saw that. What is wrong with you? It turns out there's nothing wrong with you, actually. It's entirely to do with the fact that
Hi, Sabina.
Hi.
pause that. There we go. That our selective attention is exactly doing the job it's supposed to be doing, which is, in this case, I asked you to look at the video, and when you do that, you are generally led to the idea that you're listening to a conversation, especially because of how the video is set up such that you are listening to the dialogue from the perspective of each one of the speakers. It's almost inevitable in the way that kind of we think about this. But this brings up a really good point, which is that we have a certain amount of blindness to things. It's not like our eyes didn't see, or rather, yeah, that our eyes didn't see that the plates changed, is that we just never perceived it. So that's called inattentional blindness. And it's a really funny phenomenon once you start looking at it. The other way that it shows up is with this video that some people have referenced, which is this one from the 90s, in which they asked the participants of a study to track the motion of the ball and count the amount of times it was passed between the people who were wearing the white shirt. I can almost see why it was confusing. If even now I'm looking at the photos and I'm trying to track the ball moving between in each one of the photo frames, it's really difficult to actually make out that a person is walking by in a gorilla suit. Even in the photo where the gorilla is dancing like straight up in the middle of the screen. Um, this is another example of it. Neither of these examples you have to memorize, but you do have to know the idea of inattentional blindness. There's another subtype of inattentional blindness that you need to be aware of, and it's called change blindness. Change blindness was seen in a classical experiment over here, where this poor innocent person was treated so rudely when in the frame A of the photo, somebody comes up, an experimenter, asking for directions. And in the frame B, the person who asked directions hid behind somebody pretending to come through. And then they switched spots with a new person. And then the person continued on giving the directions and didn't notice the fact that he was talking to a different person. In fact, photo D doesn't show, but they have even different outfits and different colors. And they look like they could be related, but they definitely look like different people. So this is another form of inattentional blindness, specifically change blindness, and it shows up in places in which our perception of motion has suddenly been disrupted. So what I mean by that is that in order for the person who was giving the directions to normally realize that there had been a change in the person, that person needed to have walked away and they needed to have registered that. But since the person didn't walk away and then they just put a block to it, it disrupted their regular perception of motion. So I hope that makes sense. Change blindness basically has to do with the fact that you don't notice a particular change, especially when it's right in front of you. Another type of inattentional blindness that you need to know is a funny one, which is called choice blindness. And I think we've all experienced this, especially when we get stubborn. This photo is a really good example of choice blindness. The frame A is showing two people, and in the experiment, they were asking the subjects to select, I don't know, I think it was something like, who do you think would be the nicest person of these two to go and have lunch with? Something like that. As you can see in this photo in B, this person selects the photo on the left-hand side, and then they do a little card magic trick, the experimenter does, and then they hand them the card. The subject is thinking they're receiving the one they selected, but in fact, there was a switch in the cards, and they ended up getting the other one they didn't select. They found that most people actually ended up continuing to agree with that the new person they were getting, the one in the photo D, was in fact the one that they wanted to have lunch with. And they could go so far as to defend their decision. So it wasn't just like, yeah, that's right, that was the person. So it's not just change blindness, but it's also the defense of it, which is the choice part. This one, I've seen so much in MCAT practice, and I think I even saw it in the MCAT itself, because you can kind of see how this can quickly extrapolate to the clinical setting, where people make particular choices. And so because of their realization that they haven't even switched the thing that they have in hand, they continue to defend that choice. So that's another one you need to know. Oh my gosh. You're not supposed to have that slide. It's a cool slide, but I ended up not going with it. Okay. This is the one you're supposed to have. Pardon me. Okay. So there's a couple of ideas that now that we've gone over selective attention, we got to realize that we've got all this stimulus in front of us, and we have a certain amount that inattentional blindness. I can definitely do a better job of redefining that. So you can think of inattentional blindness, excuse me as I go back. Okay. So inattentional blindness being either the choice blindness or the change blindness, those are just subtypes of it. But the main definition of it is going to be the failure to notice something that's fully visible but unexpected, because your attention was engaged in another task. And so the idea behind this is that you can kind of think of it in the quote unquote blindness, where you don't see something that's right in front of you. Remember that with most MCAT things, you don't really need to know the definition per se, but definitely understand the concept of it. And the way that I like to think about this one is the blindness part. You're not actually blind to it. It's a fact when you look at inattentional, it means that your attention isn't there for it. So that's what kind of induces the momentary blindness. So we've talked about selective attention of what we end up noticing. I'll get back to a direct message in just a moment. So we've spoken about what we end up focusing our attention on, but then there's this process of talking about what don't we focus our attention on. So in order to figure that out, a couple of theories were presented in which we were looking that scientists were looking at different filters for when it was that we lost the things that we weren't focusing on. So for example, the fact that you probably haven't noticed that you're sitting on a chair for some time means that you've at some point along the way have lost the information to it on purpose. And the first of those filter theories that you need to know is just called the filter model. The person who proposed it is called Broadbent. So the name is something that might come up, but just know that it means the filter model. Another name for it is early selection theory. I'm sorry, I should have written that. That's an important other name to know. Let's see. I'm trying to type this in chat. Early selection theory. Please write this down and associate it with the filter model and with Broadbent, so that way, when you see it, you know they're all related. So the idea behind this model is that, as you can see in the diagram, there's an input of sensory material that hits, and this is, excuse me, as you can see, this is based off of, this is rows from the dichotic listening tasks, in which Broadbent proposed that the sensory information is hitting the attended and the unattended ear. In this case, the attended ear is the red arrows. And so because you're paying attention to that, the red arrows go through a filter and then they arrive to a place where their meaning is associated with the perception of it. And then they go on to other places in memory. The unattended channel is apparently hitting the right ear, and then it hits a block at the filter, and then none of it goes through. Can you think of a problem with this theory? Oh, let me rephrase that. Can you think of something that opposes this theory that we just spoke about? Something that I said you are 100 million% going to see on the MCAT. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with a pirate and a dog. The cocktail party effect. Exactly, Zoe. I'm a killer. The cocktail party effect is a really clear opposition to this theory of it. And the reason why it's an opposition is because we saw that while we weren't attending the information in the unattended channel, some things did go through and register. So that filter can't be entirely blocking the unattended channel. One thing to know about early selection models is that it seems to hold true when the thing that we're paying attention to is complex. Think about it this way. if you are focusing on an organic chemistry reaction that you struggled with in OChem and are continuing to struggle with now, there's a very high chance that you are not going to get information from the unattended channels. Meaning, like, if there was a car that went outside, or if you heard the sound of somebody walking nearby. So this seems to hold true for the cases where something is complex, and that's worthwhile writing down. The next of the theories is somewhere, it kind of moves the filter a little bit farther ahead on the process. And wow, did you just come up with that? That's good. I would I would definitely write that down if it works for you. The next one is the attenuation model. See if you can come up with a mnemonic for this one. It was created by Treisman, and incidentally, Treisman is a scientist who died like in 2018, and she was one of the first female cognitive psychologists. She was a badass in her field, and definitely began her career when so few women were out there, and she recently died. She's really known for her studies also of selective attention, and she was also interested a lot in the dichotic listening task. So before I tell you about the model, let me tell you about something I haven't told you about the about the dichotic listening task. This lady with a hairdo that looks so intense is an example of a dichotic listening task in which the people were listening to stories. And so they were asked in the shadowed ear or the attended ear to hear the story. In the picnic basket, she had peanut butter, book, leaf, proof, sample, always. In the unattended channel, she had what you can see in that little box, which is those objects, and then in bold, the sandwich and chocolate and brownies. What she found was that when you would have these stories that the subjects would listen to, there was sometimes a chance where they would respond, as you can see in the little bubble, by joining together the stories in ways that made meaningful sense. So in this case, you can see that the thing that is shadowed or responded back is actually a whole part of the story. Yes, Monica, thank you for asking. The shadowed ear is the attended ear. The unattended ear is just the unattended channel. That's it. So shadowed ear and attended ear are the ones that people are asked to listen to. Like, I'm just typing a text when you heard it. Yeah, exactly, Aditya. That's a really good. Please write that down, because that way it's meaningful in your memory, and we'll talk about that later, of a way to remember this effect of the dichotic listening task. And I hope people understand this real life example that Aditya has just posted there. It's a really good one. So Treisman found this effect happening in the dichotic listening task. And so then she came up with a subsequent model to kind of explain something of what was occurring. And the selection is somewhere in the middle. But what I mean by selection, it means like the things that make it through the filter and the things that don't make it through the filter. And so what you can see here is kind of a modified one of the early selection theory, and that the filter for the unattended ear, which is the green arrow, is kind of porous. So some things make it through. And then when they make it through, they can make it through into a place where they're analyzed for meaning and given perception. So good. I'm glad so far that these are PG-13 mnemonics. There's a reason why mnemonics that are not PG-13 work really well. Mostly because just sex sticks in our mind. So in your own private time, I really do recommend you come up with raunchy ways of remembering them, because they really won't go away once you do. the one that everybody knows is the TCA cycle, right? Everybody knows that one. If you don't know it, you should know it because it's just not going to go away once you know it. So it's really useful to have mnemonics, especially ones that are on the raunchier side. Oh, Tiffany, you know it. You know it. Can somebody write the Krebs cycle one while I continue talking about this? So this is the idea that you got to know is that the attenuation model makes, thank you, Sophie. That's exactly it. You start, can is citrate and officer is oxaloacetate. All right. So the idea that you got to know about this is that attenuation is weakening. So the last thing I'm going to say about this slide is that you see that the unattended channel is a green arrow. So it doesn't come through as a green arrow. It's a weakened one. So it doesn't mean that everything made it through that filter. It's only the things that together contributed to the picture of the story that we saw in the previous example with dichotomy task. Oh, I'm sorry. This also was a slide that has two meshed images. So if you need to take a screenshot, do so now in the 3 seconds that you have. Alrighty. So the last one that you need to know is just along the sequence. It's called the late selection model. You don't need to remember that it was created by some people, last names Deutsch and Deutsch. But definitely recognize late selection model. The idea behind this is that the selection of it is far along the channel from input to response. So the idea here is that everything makes its way through the meaning analysis process of it. So you can see that the green arrows go through it entirely green, and then they hit a filter later on. The idea behind this one is that remember how I said that early selection seems to show up for complex information. In this case, easy information makes its way, easy tasks, excuse me, show up in the late selection model. A good way to think about this is if you're doing something that is next to automated, say you are washing dishes, it's perhaps well, it depends on how much you hate dishes, but for most people, it's a task that you're so physically familiar with that paying attention doesn't cost that much resources. Therefore, so many more things of the unattended channel can make their way through this into perceptual analysis. That's about the only thing I want to say about that one. The only, yeah, that's about it. The other stuff is, I don't want to add more information. The more basic, the more better. But basically know that the only things that make their way through are semantic content, meaning the stuff that has true meaning to you. Let me see if I can think of an example. Let's see. Right. So the idea behind this is that Monica, the idea behind these processing theories is that that these people propose different ways in which input is processed into a response. Michaela, that's almost it. I think that's almost a good example of it. So Monica, the idea is that it's not necessarily that certain things get processing. You don't think about it this way. Just think about it as a proposition of 3 different models as to where along the stage between input and response, you're going to forget the things in the unattended channel. The first one we saw was early, which meant that everything went away the moment it hit your sensory receptors. The second one we saw was attenuated, which meant that certain things came through, but the ones that did come through were weekend. And this last one is late selection, meaning that everything comes through except, and then it hits a filter. And the thing that makes it past the filter are those things that have meaningful value to us. And what I was saying about the early selection is that we see that it shows up with complex tasks, the things that require a lot of our focus. And the late selection model shows up in very easy tasks that don't require a lot of our attention. Exactly. Thank you for pointing that out. That's exactly right. I should have pointed that out, Monica. And all of these theories, the attended input is just like fine. It's just going from input to response. And then these theories, thank you. That's a really good point, Monica. These theories are talking about what happens with the unattended, meaning the things that we lose in the process. So hopefully everybody caught that clarification by Monica, because it's a really good one. For attenuate is a certain task that appears in it. The only, if I'm understanding that correctly, Marissa, the only thing you got to know about attenuated in terms of examples of it, remember if you can, the dichotic listening task when people were listening to stories and they mushed together things from the attended channel and some elements of the unattended channel to make a complete cohesive story. I hope that's what you're referring to. Yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome. All right. So here's a question for you. I really wanted to bring donuts, but I didn't. Okay, can you see this? This is a mason jar lid. And this is the one without the lid. So I have a question for you. You're paying attention to the thing I'm raising to the screen. Is your attention focused on the ring? Is it focused on the metal and its contours? Or is it focused on a specific position in space? My glasses, right. Yeah, let me get out of the way so that you can see it. So the focus is on the ring itself. So what you're saying, Jonathan, is that your focus isn't on, say, like a little square space on your screen where within that square the ring is. You're saying you're focusing on the ring itself. The square space and within it, the ring. Yeah, yeah. Well, it turns out that we actually do a little bit of both. And the way that we know that we do a little bit of both is through a really interesting yet sad case of particular types of brain injury. This is called, or one of them, the main, I should call it the main category of this brain injury is called unilateral neglect syndrome. It's important that you know this one for the MCAT, but it's also important that you kind of get an understanding of this one so that you do not confuse it with so many different types of other seemingly similar types of brain injuries. This one usually happens, not strictly, but usually when there's injury to the parietal lobe. And it's an injury that affects our faculties of attention. It can affect our attentions, especially when it hits, it's typically, I should say, it typically shows up on one side of the body, like because when there's one injury to one side of the parietal lobe, for some reason, it seems to show up on the right parietal lobe. So the right parietal lobe processes things from, you tell me, the left or the right-hand side of our world. Right, exactly. I shouldn't say correct, I should say. It's from the left side. And this is because of what? Can you think of the name of the concept? It starts with contra. Not the chiasm, Michaela. contralateral processing or contralateral control, right? The chiasm, Michaela, just to remember, is the part where sensory neurons coming from the retinas cross over. So contralateral processing is a bigger and more generalized process in which things that are from the left-hand side of our world in both the touch, the view, the sound ends up processed on the right side of our brain. And likewise, vice versa for the right side of our world and the left side of our brain. What you're bringing up is a very related concept, but that's specific to the process of vision. So contralateral control tells us that if the injury is particular to the right parietal lobe, then there's going to be an effect on the left-hand side of the world. And so we see that with people with unilateral neglect syndrome, in that they end up not being able to notice, say, like half of what's going on in their left side of the world. For example, they could have a full plate of food in front of them and only eat the food on the right-hand side of the plate. Or they could be looking at a picture, but only notice the right-hand side of the picture. This is seen in some of these drawings in which experimenters showed a model on the left-hand side and asked people with the neglect syndrome to draw what they saw. And as you can see, they drew only the right-hand side of things. And that's because the left parietal lobe was intact. Yeah, Aditya, it's typically seen as an injury to the right parietal lobe, which means that the left side of our world is affected. Yeah, exactly. Right. So another way of framing this question would have been if I tell you a little bit about neglect syndrome and I tell you, look at this patient's copy, what side of the brain is affected? Hopefully you might say the right side of the brain is affected. So why does this tell us that we look at both objects and positions in space? Well, in this case, we're looking at the position, meaning that it's basically like the subject drew, like is if you could do a line down the middle of the model, the subject drew what was on the right-hand side of that line, meaning that was the position in space. So that you're just looking at the right-hand side. There's also evidence for the fact that it could be objects that they're attending to. In these same patients, you can see that they did some very interesting tests in which they asked them to draw, as you can see on the left-hand side, this building that looks like an arrow. And when it's upright, you can see that they drew half of it, kind of like we saw in the previous picture with the flower in the house. But then the experimenters did something really interesting, which was that then they rotated the image. What you would expect if we only saw positions would be that they would only draw the things on the right-hand side of the dotted black line. But in fact, they followed it so that they ended up drawing the things underneath the red line, meaning that they were looking at the right side of the object and not the position. Yeah, on the right-hand side of the clock, I think, right. Yes, Brooke, if I'm understanding what you're saying is that the hands of the clock made it past the middle of the line. Is that correct? Yes, exactly, Brooke. That's the really good observation. That tells you that it's not a perfectly positional thing. In fact, it's also an object. Because in my interpretation of this, the subject is able to follow the line as following the object and then draws the right-hand side of the object. It's better illustrated in this following example where they rotate it. So does everybody understand how this proves how we see both objects and positions? Sadly, a lot of the things that we understand about the brain are because of injuries of the brain, because we're able to see where the injuries are, and then we're able to study what are the vision, in this case, the perceptual defect. The last thing I want to say about this before moving on is that I do not want you to confuse this with a blindness. This is not a retina thing. There are retina things that are like defects to the visual processing system. This is an attention thing. So this is very trippy, and I hope you can appreciate that this is a fact that it's a defect in the brain that does not allow these patients to attend to it, meaning they cannot pay attention to it. So do not confuse this, because there will be other examples of other kinds of blindness. And that's where the MCAT will get you, because they'll try to confuse you as to the source of it. And this is actually to do with attention. So Monica, the syndrome is showing us that we pay attention to both objects and positions in space. So this is just a piece of evidence as to why it is that we look at that. I want to say that the more important thing about this slide is actually the neglect syndrome, more than the fact that we look at objects or positions, or I should say both. But it's really good to be familiar with the concept, because oftentimes they can present questions with unilateral neglect syndrome with the sort of things that they're tied to in attention. Right. So when it comes to blindness, Tiffany, the big takeaway right now that I want you to take away is that there's going to be a blindness where, let's say, for example, you have an injury to your retina that does not allow you to perceive on both retinas the left-hand side of the world. That's going to be a retinal blindness, such that your eyes cannot detect it, meaning the light hits your eyes, but it's not processed. In this case of neglect syndrome, the eyes do process this. It makes its way through the neurons, but it gets to a place in the brain where it would be processed for attentional purposes, and that's where it fails. So that's what I want you to make sure that you understand, because that could be a trick question where they get you to think that this is in fact something to do with earlier on when light hits our eyes, and that's not the case. Does that make sense? Cool. All righty. Divided attention. So everything we just spoke about for an hour was selective attention. Divided attention is one slide. And all you really need to know is the things that you already know. And I could sum it up by saying, don't text and drive. Don't do it. It's just scientifically proven. It's just not a good idea to do it. That's basically all I got to say about divided attention. JK, I'll say a little bit more. The task similarity matters. So like, let's say you're going to divide your attention, which is that you're going to selectively attend more than one thing at a time. If the tasks are very similar, you're going to have a hard time doing it, and your performance is going to go down. If the tasks are dissimilar, doing divided attention is going to be a little bit easier. When a task is similar, a really good evidence of that is me asking you to read a book and listen to what I'm saying. Those are both using language centers of your brain, and it's going to decrease the performance a lot more dramatically than, say, if they're different. For example, you start knitting while listening to this lecture. Both use different centers of the brain. One would be more for mechanical manual manipulation, and the other one's more language. Despite whether they're similar or dissimilar, performance is going to go down for either of them. That's something you just can't go about. But the thing that's going to help the performance improve of both tasks is by practicing. And practice is basically what it just sounds like. It's repeating the task of doing the two things at once. The more you practice, the less you're going to use in your sort of currency of attentional resources. So it's going to cost less. to do both of those things at the same time. You could get so good at doing it that at some point it could create a sense of automaticity. Automaticity is the things that you see when, for example, you are like shower in a very specific way, where you absolutely don't even put any thought to it. Or if you walk and you have no thought that goes into it, practice makes really good. The downside of automaticity is that it could be error prone when you interject a new element to it. Like, let's say I ask you to walk, but pay attention to your left foot every time you step, for example, or ask you to do your shower routine backwards. Those are the kinds of things that then would make the performance more, it would worsen the performance, perhaps more than if you had done it for the first time. That's all you need to know about automaticity. And then it's easier to divide your attention between familiar tasks. That makes sense, right? It's really hard to do divided attention over things that you've never done once. And if you've done them multiple times, it becomes easier. Literally, that's all you need to know about divided attention. And you need to know that performance goes down. It goes down so dramatically that car accidents happen at such an incredibly higher rate than if you were not texting while driving. It's interesting that you can actually be listening to like a co-pilot. So like you're having input of somebody like gossiping while you're driving. And you don't see at all the same rates of accidents. The reality behind that is not that the other person is not dividing your attention. It is dividing your attention. But the fact is that the other human, well, typically, unless they're like really involved in the gossip, they're also perceiving the road. And so when they notice that certain things get sticky, let's say you hit traffic or you're about to hit a stoplight, people's actual way of speaking as a co-pilot, I mean, actually responds to the fact that they realize that the person driving needs to pay more attention. It happens all the time without us realizing it. So just don't text and trip. All right. Any questions about selected or divided attention? No? Do I still have your attention? Okay, we have a question. Yeah, choice blindness, Marissa. So remember that we have inattentional blindness, and then we have two subcategories. One is change blindness and one is choice blindness. Choice blindness is the one in which you select something. How can I phrase this correctly? I keep on just thinking back at that photo that we saw, which was that they asked the experimenter to select one person, yet they asked the subject to select a person, yet the experimenter gave them the photo of the other one. Because they had made a choice, they were blind to the fact that there was a change. And what makes this particular choice blindness called choice blindness is that they go on to defend their choice as to why they selected it, even though they ended up looking at a different photo entirely. So it's a form of inattentional blindness that shows up when you make a specific choice, but you are so focused on the choice itself that you've made that you forget that when you see the change in the actual perception of it, in the actual fact of it, that you're unaware of that change. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. The best way I remember it, Marissa, is by remembering that photo. And I'll go back to it at the end if we want to talk about it further. And then we have a question in the chat that says, similarity tasks being easier to divide. Right. So there's two things that came up with divided attention. The last point that says is if familiar tasks are easier to divide, meaning that you can do divided attention on things that you're familiar with. Think about familiar in terms of just basically something that you've always done. That's easier to do. Yeah, versus, for example, a scenario where you're hearing two people talk, um, that would be a difficult task just because it's something that is not a familiar thing, that you don't, it's not familiar to us, most of us, to have multiple people talking to us at once. If it was, then it would become a little bit easier. I hope that makes more sense. Alrighty. So we're going to move on to memory. And memory is just so important for the MCAT. This one, I'm afraid, is going to be a little bit term heavy. And the terms are, in my consideration, pretty important. So what I suggest here is, as I go along, you scribbling ways for you to kind of understand them in some way, these terms, instead of focusing at all on the definitions of it. Because if you focus on definitions, then this section alone will give you a headache. But instead, try to like associate those things with something that makes meaning to you, whether it's a mnemonic or just some understanding of an example of it. I usually tend to go to examples more than definitions, because the MCAT presents them as examples and they ask you to recognize it instead of giving you a definition. So let's start off with the basic framework for this. There's this thing called the information processing theory. And what you need to know about it, or like what I think you need to know about it, is basically associated with an analogy. This theory came up around the 50s alongside the creation of a lot of computer systems. And so cognitive psychologists were really interested in figuring out to what extent brains mimicked the way that computers worked. And they came up with this very general idea called information processing theory, which is that we can think of memory going from the stimulus that we were just talking and all the way into memory as a computer receives information and stores it in a CPU, which is a processing unit. And then you can grab it from a hard drive. So it's stored there, but then a hard drive is the one that allows you to take things in and out of it. The way that these stages are called, that you should know them, is that it's a stage of encoding, storage, and retrieval. That's all I'm going to say for this one. It'll certainly get more complicated in just a moment. So let's talk about the first part of memories, which is encoding things into memories. We've talked a ton about attention, and attention is the thing that you need in order to begin to encode. So far we've talked from the very beginning about stimulus, perception, attention, and now we're at the place where, remember the selection processing theories we were just talking about, how they talked about memory? Now we're at the place of memory, finally. So we're going to start talking about some bigger concepts now. A lot of these things obviously don't have, we have not yet figured out the neurological basis to them, but we definitely have observed certain things. In the case of encoding, we've noticed that there's levels of encoding. And this diagram, I think, does a really good job of showing you the levels of it. It goes from shallow processing to deep processing. And the ways that we can kind of subdivide it is by looking at structural encoding, which is the physical structure of a stimulus. And then in the middle, phonemic encoding, which has to do with what those words sound like. And then the deep processing, which is semantic encoding, which means that what the meaning of something is. This is why it's so important for you in your studies to go through and try to find meaning to things, because that's the first deepest way of getting something encoded into memory. If you just simply say something, like the sound of a word, it's likely not going to stick as much as you having a meaning associated to it. And even more so, if you, in the shallow one, if you just look at the structure of the word on the page, you're definitely not going to remember that very well. So there's ways to make information stick into memory a little bit better. So what we spoke about were just back here, we spoke about the three different um, types of encoding. So the structure, the phenom, and the semantic. But here's some ways in which you can make sure that things into encoding make it past encoding and hopefully get stored into memory. The first one is elaboration. Elaboration is one that you definitely need to know. And it's basically the idea that you are you're basically studying. Elaborating means that you keep on enriching the stimulus such that it gets more and more meaning. One way that you can do it is just by looking at examples. So elaboration is not a rote repetition of something where you're saying the same thing to yourself over and over, but you're saying to yourself, early processing theory, or early selection theory, complex material, cocktail party effect is a contradiction to it. So you keep on adding more and more things. The other one that helps encoding happen more successfully is visual imagery. And this we see all the time. And that is why I stay up so late putting pictures in these slides, because it is so important for encoding for there to be different kinds of stimuli. Specifically, visual imagery seems to help a lot in the process of encoding. The other one that you need to know is the self-referent encoding. And that one is the one where you attach personal meaning to something. And that a really good example is what a couple of you have said in real life examples of ways in which, I can't remember if it was Monica or Aditya was talking about in the attenuated model, how you're typing up something and suddenly you end up typing what somebody else said. That's a really good self-referent model of encoding. What that person was doing when they were giving that example was helping out the process of getting that memory encoded so that it sticks better in their memory stores. And the last one is the motivation to remember. Motivation to remember does marvels for encoding. It's studied a lot when they actually tell people that if you remember a list of words successfully, we will give you $10. Versus saying, if you remember, just participate in the study where you have to remember this list of words. The diagram on the screen shows you an example of what that looks like, where there's motivation to remember at the time of encoding, so when they're encountering the stimulus. And then at the moment of retrieval, meaning when they're trying to remember, the people who had a motivation were more successful in recalling than the people who did not have a motivation. You can think of certain ways in which you can do that for yourself. And one that's really easy is just tell yourself you're going to have chocolate after you finish that question set. Like, how many people do that? If you haven't done that, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. Start telling yourself that you are going to remember the citric acid cycle, come hell or high water melon. And you are not going to have chocolate until you remember it. And you are definitely going to have an easier time of recalling that once you're trying to test yourself than if you didn't have chocolate in the picture. The last thing I'll say about these is that these are not certain things that I would say stress that you have to have in a flashcard that you remember it, but you should recognize them. And recognize the fact that these are just different mechanisms of making encoding more successful. So I spoke briefly 2 slides ago about information processing models, which was we talked about how things went from encoding to storage to retrieval. And there was the analogy of a computer. The this was information processing is just a big umbrella term for a number of theories that came up, which were trying to figure out what is the mechanism that gets memory to happen. And the most influential of the information processing theories is something called the modal model, which was proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin. Again, don't remember the names, but it's good for me to write them there so that at some point later you might be able to recognize them and it might ring a bell. The modal model basically describes the diagram that's on the screen, which is really nice. It says that there's these boxes. And in these boxes, there's going to be memory. And that to move from these boxes, you follow these arrows. And it shows you that there's two temporary stores. One is going to be the sensory memory, and the other one is the short-term memory. And then there's a longer store, which is the long-term memory. We can see the arrows are labeled, and the sensory input is the first one, so that it goes into sensory memory. Sensory input is just basically the information hitting our sensory organs. And then attention is the thing we just spoke about for an hour. That arrow is what we spoke about for an hour, that it gets from sensory memory to short-term memory. And then we'll speak more about the storage and retrieval as well. So the process, the only thing I want to say that you must know is that you have to know sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. They're associated with the information processing model, and the most common of, or the one that's most tested, I should say, is the modal model of it. And it looks in a basic format like this. So let's talk about the first part. We talked about encoding, excuse me. Now we're going to talk about storage, which is the second step. And so the storage happens in the first box called the sensory memory. The sensory memory is the one that holds the information that our sense organs receive, and they hold it for seconds. And after that, they're gone. So the type of information that you're most likely going to have to know is the visual, and it decays in about half a second. And then the auditory, which decays in about 3 to 4 seconds, and then the haptic, which is touch. You do not need to know the time frame of decay for haptic. But sensory memory is the one that explains why the picture in the diagram occurs. So the reality is that we do not, let me put it this way. Let me phrase it in a question. In that photo, is what's happening that the light leaves traces of light around, meaning that the sparkler leaves energy in the form of light around it? Is that actually what's happening? Right. It's not. What the sparkler is doing is just sparkling light from the tip of the sparkler. But what's happening here is a process in which our eyes, and here it's actually kind of curious because we're looking at a photo, so it has to do with the fact that there's exposure to this in order for us to see this. But if we had a true camera, like that it was just mimicking exactly real life, where it captured an instant in time, we would see actually we would just see the tip of the sparkler. We wouldn't see the fuzziness of it, right? Likewise, our eyes, like cameras, just see the tip of the sparkler, and it just sees like one dot of light moving around. But the thing here that's happening is actually an effect of sensory memory. We are actually holding a memory for a half a second of visual input coming in our brain. I hope that blows your, that's actually an effect of memory that we're seeing right there. It means that even though a sparkler might be on one side of the figure eight, in reality, we're still remembering from half a second ago the light that was being traced over there at night. It's particularly easy to do at night because of the contrast between the light and the dark. Um, so that's actually what's happening here. Auditory information holds on a little bit longer, but as you can see, it still decays. One way to think about this is actually an echo of a memory. Even theorists think that we actually don't even hold it in a box like the modal model proposes. And instead, we actually just have an echo of it. It's like a sort of echo of the experience, but it's actually not held in memory because it's so being prone to getting forgotten. The next box is the short-term memory. And that's where storage becomes a little bit of longer duration. You can store things unrehearsed for about 10 to 20 seconds. But the way that you can extend that time frame is with rehearsal. Rehearsal actually allows you to extend that time indefinitely. So as long as you're rehearsing something, it can maintain itself in short-term memory. Rehearsing is the sort of stuff that we do when we're practicing something, when we're trying to make something stick beyond short-term memory. And there's a number of ways we can do that, and I'll talk about them in a moment. The capacity of storage of this is one theory that's actually not so widely used anymore, but the MCAT's still stuck on it, is the 7 plus or minus 2 theory of storage. And it means it's going to store no more than 9 items at a time. So that seems to, or excuse me, that our capacity to store items is between 5 and 9 items in it. So an example would be giving you 9 numbers, or giving you 9 names, or 9 objects. That's about the maximum you can store in short-term memory. That number is so important for you to remember. You may as well just get it tattooed because it will show up, probably as a right answer or as a misleading one. But the idea is that short-term memory can only hold about that much. Please tell me you're going to remember that. 7 plus or minus 2. It's kind of catchy. All right. But the thing about that box, the items, there's a question in the chat that says 7 plus or minus 2 what items that you can remember. I know that's vague, but think about that in terms of like just the thing you have to remember. If you have to remember a name, or if you have to remember a number, an object, a location, and all of those would be classified as a number. A phone number is different, Monica, because of something called chunking. So there's a great likelihood that that you actually remember an area code. So in my case, I'm the 707. And I remember 707 as 1 item. I don't remember it as 3 items. Perhaps if you're looking at an international number and there's no little subdivisions of spaces or line breaks, then you would probably be looking at, you could think of that as 9 items. But that's a good question. So yeah, don't confuse a phone number, because phone numbers are subject to chunking. So remember how we looked at this other image where there was a short-term memory box? It was just like a nice little yellow box that had like a rehearsal arrow. Well, some people weren't happy with that. They weren't happy with that, and they said it's actually way more complicated. We don't actually just hold stuff in there, and that's it. Then they came up with this process known as, or this theory called the working memory. So what you got to do now is write something that tells you, when I see short-term memory and working memory, they're related. Short-term memory is, now we can think about it as a very general term, and working memory, we can think about a more complex term that talks about different subdivisions within working memory. This diagram does a really good job of showing that working memory is the subdividing of short-term memory, the bucket, the box, into different compartments. The first of those compartments is the phonological loop. You have to know that term. It's a really funny term, but you got to know it. The phonological loop is the one that uses, that is most engaged in the maintenance rehearsal, in the practicing of it. It's the process that we do when we're repeating our number to ourselves. When somebody says, my phone number is blah, 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 blah. It's the one that you say to yourself and you're like replaying it. It's important to know that phonological, as the name suggests, has to do with the phonetics, which has to do with remembering language. That it's not just the process of when we're like whispering to ourselves a number, so we keep it in short-term memory. It's also when we remember it. So it's the same thing for us to say it out loud as it is for us to think of it in our head. Okay? So remember that. It's not just the actual utterance of it, because it's not us remembering the sound of us saying it. It's actually us repeating it in our head, but we just have a habit of saying it out loud. So make sure you understand that. The next component of it is the visual spatial sketchpad. And this is a really interesting one that shows up when we're trying to do something in our head by holding it in a map. It mostly shows up, like, for example, when we're trying to think of like, okay, I gotta get from here to here. And in your head, you're holding a memory of the map. This also shows up, and this is interesting, this is worthwhile writing down. It also shows up in algorithms and math, and in that kind of cognitive capacity. In those cases, it's because, yes, we've all experienced, you're probably doing multiplication and division and subtraction in your head. And so that's kind of also a map. You can kind of think about it as a beautiful mind, and you're like, what's this actor's name? I can't remember, but it's the guy who's like manipulating numbers in space. And so that's a really good way of kind of thinking about this visual spatial sketchpad for it. And I like the idea of a sketchpad because it kind of allows you, like when you're sketching, to kind of manipulate something. The other one that you need to know is the central executive. And this one is different than the other three because it is not a place for storing memory. It's highlighted here in green, so it kind of seems distinct. Instead, it's the place where you coordinate all three compartments so that they all are working together in tandem. And the last part is the episodic buffer. And that's the one that integrates the information and that connects the short-term memory to long-term memory. So whereas in the short-term memory diagram we saw a few slides ago, there was just one arrow from the bucket from short-term memory to long-term memory. Now we have working memory, and specifically the episodic buffer is the one that connects to the long-term memory. So you got to know that part. That's mostly what the function of the episodic buffer is. So I urge you to remember that you have the phonological loop, which is the one that's helping you when it comes to remembering the things that have to do with the language aspect of things. And it's what's present when we're repeating something to ourselves so that we don't forget it. And the visual spatial sketchpad is another place where we hold memories, but in this case, we're manipulating them more in sort of mental maps, not in language ones. That's a good way to kind of think of like how these two interface with the central executive, which is kind of like the motherboard and kind of controlling things. And the episodic buffer is the one that that connects the two. The purple things that are present, I got a question in the chat that says the purple things that are present are arrows in which like these different compartments talk to each other. So you can think about activity taking place between these two. and sort of channels. One way that I like to think about it is that you have input that comes into this box and it hits the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad, depending on the type of activity it is. But it's got to move through that, through the central executive and then to the episodic buffer. What I like about this diagram is that it shows that the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad do not connect with the episodic buffer. Instead, it has to connect with the central executive. And then the central executive is the only one that connects with the episodic buffer. It's an aorta, if you will. And it makes its way out the heart. And long-term memory is LTM. All right, I want you to look at this picture, and I want you to just take a moment and look at this professor's office, and I'll come back and ask you some questions about it. All righty, but before that, I'm going to talk about the last part of the storage, which is the long-term memory. So here's probably the most important part of long-term memory is that it's unlimited in terms of how many items you can put in there. How long do the items stay in there? Indefinitely. They can stay there forever and ever and ever and ever. Is there evidence to support that? Why, yes. There's two pieces of evidence. The first one, you don't need to know very well, but I just included it for the giggles, which was that earlier on in memory experiments, it wasn't even actually memory experiences, it was experiments. It was actually brain surgery in which electrical stimulation to a certain part of the brains that had the patients also awake suddenly had patients talking about memories that were flooding back with great accuracy and detail about their childhood, things that without the stimulation they wouldn't have recalled. That's an observed thing that's definitely taking place when you are activating certain parts of the brain, and then people have the response of saying like, "Oh my gosh, I'm suddenly back remembering, like I'm in my grandmother's kitchen and she's baking bread, and I haven't remembered that ever." The other thing that you must know for the MCAT is flashbulb memories, and flashbulb memories are an example of why we think that the storage is unlimited and duration is indefinite. Flashbulb memories are really easy to remember when you think about them as the 9/11 example. Although I am wondering now, is it possible that any of you were born after 9/11? I mean, because I guess theoretically you could be. Yeah. Yeah, some of you, it's very possible we're in diapers for it. So this is not maybe the example it once was, because the 9/11 is a really good example when you have memory of something from a certain age. Like this only works if you can remember, like say 4 years and on, but this doesn't work if you can't remember if you were a baby. Oh my gosh, Michael, I definitely don't have a flashbulb memory. Okay, so let me talk about flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are the ones that a particular impactful moment of your life, which is not Michael Jackson dying for me, but is 9/11, is something that you remember in very vivid detail, more vivid detail than a regular memory. You even associate emotional responses to it. It can be traumatic. It doesn't have to be traumatic, but it definitely is something that you remember very, very well. You remember more than I do, Alexandra. So 9/11, okay, wow, I'm gonna have to revise this because I don't know, but 9/11, there's a possibility that many of you, or not many, but some of you might not actually have a flashbulb memory of it, but I have a flashbulb memory of it, as well as any adult now born, I don't know, like 1995 and onwards. And basically it is that, like, in my case, it was like, oh, so here's the thing. So it's 7:30 a.m. California, and in the living room, we're playing it in the TV that was there, and then go to school, and then everything was weird at school. Seventh grade, my first period was math. So I remember it very vividly. Alexandra, that's, yeah. So if you have the memory that's more vivid than regular memories, that is of a specific point in time. Think about a flashbulb in terms of the sense that it's just like one of those old time cameras that it's like a big flash where it captures a photo in time, where it's so realistic to you, and it's something that for you is just like it's definitely you're like sure more than anything of it. That's a flashbulb memory. So there's issues with these two pieces of evidence though. And for the first one with the brain stimulation, it actually turns out that that what we thought we were stimulating, like memories that were just buried but inaccessible, actually turns out that a lot of them were very embellished and very fabricated. In some cases were just false. They just never occurred. And this is also seen with flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories, what we think are very accurate and vivid details, actually over time become very, very distorted. For example, I just told you that I remember it clearly as being 7:30 a.m. and there being a big TV in the living room that we used to see it. The TV wasn't in the living room at all. My parents were like, "You're crazy. It wasn't there." The TV was in the kitchen because like a Latino family, you couldn't like possibly not have a TV in the kitchen. And they were like, it wasn't big, it was small. And you didn't go to school right ahead. Like we actually had to wait because we had heard that maybe school might happen or might not happen. And these are all things that that in the case of the photo of the TV, we actually have photographic evidence that it was right there at that time. And I just thought so clearly that it was in the living room. Marissa, exactly. Let's start calling this the Titanic one instead of the 9/11 one. But the point is that even Rose was probably making some shit up for sure. Because what we think of flashbulb memory is actually very, very liable to actually have false intrusions in them, and actually things that over time become very embellished. So that's what you need to know. So I love Titanic. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so long-term memory. You need to know that what you need to know: unlimited storage, unlimited time, flashbulb memories. Gotta know a flashbulb memory. So there's a couple ways in which we store things in our memory. So far I've talked to you about putting memories in boxes, but I haven't told you like what the memory looks like, like if it's a neuron or what it is. And so this slide is going to tell you a little bit about how things are organized in there. And the first of it is clustering and conceptual hierarchy. So what this proposes is that the memories are organized and represented in clusters and conceptual hierarchies. Clusters are things that are related. So groups of things, for example, if you think about pastries, cupcakes, cakes, croissants, sugar, butter, those are ways in which memories naturally become clustered into sort of little organizational pockets that are thematically related and have meaning that we can tie together. And another way that it shows up is conceptual hierarchies. Conceptual hierarchies is arguably more important for you to remember than clustering. And an example of conceptual hierarchies is right here in the diagram, where there's a drink and then there gets subdivided as like alcohol or a beverage, and then it gets subdivided and subdivided. The thing about it that makes sense is that there's hierarchies, right? There's a very general sort of memory, and then it gets more specialized into other types of memories. This is another way for you to remember conceptual hierarchies. I hope this is giving you the heebie-jeebies. But this is thank you, Monica. That's the response I was looking for. But this is exactly a conceptual hierarchy that you could potentially, if you tried, hold in your brain, and which would be this sort of hierarchy of one memory of like, what is a compound? And then it could begin to get subdivided into isomers and then so on and so on. By the way, this is really good for y'all to remember because sadly, you will see this a lot. Schemas are another way that we organize memory, or so that we propose that we organize memories, I should say. So I want to go back to the photo that I asked you to remember earlier of the professor's office. And I hope you're not looking at the photo and you're looking at my screen right here that doesn't have anything. But if you aren't looking at the photo, what are some of the objects that you remember being in the photo? Okay, balloon, rug. Anything else you remember in the office? That's all you got. I think that's all you got. Okay, perfect. Alrighty, this didn't work really well. It didn't work as it should have. And I'll momentarily go back and as for another screenshot of the previous slide. What I was hoping you would say was that there were books in the office, and nobody said that. If you would have had said that, yeah, people were remembering 4 chairs. It's like, that's crazy. That's just nuts. Somebody said a bookcase, but there's no books here. Nobody said books that I read. Oh, you said books? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, good. Tiffany, thank you. You're so helpful today. Okay, so Tiffany was the only one who did this right, which was people were supposed to say, oh, the office had books. And the reality is, if you look at the photo, I didn't change it. It's exactly the same photo. Yeah, I guess so, Jonathan. That you would have said books because of schemas. Schemas are ways in which we organize things by particular categories. Specifically, this is related to clusters, but the cluster is the knowledge about a particular object that you have from previous experience with the object. So if I say the word or the term professor's object, then you would think like, oh yeah, so professor's object, and that has lots of papers, books, markers, disorganization, etc., etc. So schemas are the ones that allow us to have memories represented in ways in which we have clusters of particular subjects or particular memories that come about because of previous experience that we have with it. So it's important for you to write down with schema that it has to do with previous experience. You can't have schemas about things you've never experienced. So that's one way to distinguish it from a cluster, because a cluster has nothing to do with experience of something. A cluster simply has to do a deja vu. Yeah, that's more of a forgetting thing, Jonathan, which we'll talk about later on, which is like you've forgotten where you've seen something, but you think you've seen it already. So that's the concept of schemas. I'm going to quickly go back here for a screenshot. 1, 2, 3 screenshot. And then 1, 2, 3 screenshot. Okay. All right. The next one you need to know is semantic networks. And this one is one in which it's best explained in this diagram, in which you have one thing that you're remembering, which is the fire engine. But adjacent to the fire engine, you have so many other concepts. The farther you get from the fire engine, the least related they are with the fire engine. Also notice that there's some distinction in the length of the lines. The farther the length of the line, the closer the length of the line to the fire engine, the closer we are to remembering that thing. And the farther, then the more difficult it is to remember that thing. This semantic networks, so the definition of it is just a network. You can think of it as a sort of like a cobweb. The effect that takes place is called spreading activation. So when I say fire engine, without you intending to, spreading activation begins, and suddenly there's resources in the brain that get these adjacent words activated so that they're remembered easier than like if they need to be remembered. So what this proposes is that we don't just have a memory of fire engine, we have a memory of fire engine that which happens to be related to all these other things. There was a game that I used to play that I don't know why people didn't get more into it when I was studying with people, but I really quite liked it, which I called MCAT popcorn, which was employing this idea of spreading activation. So I would say, okay, let's focus on ChemPhys. And so I would say temperature, and then somebody else would have to say kelvins. And then somebody would say the conversion of Kelvin to Celsius. And then somebody would say the freezing point of water in Celsius. Then somebody would say that water had polar sides to it. So that was a sort of thing that was employing spreading activation. It's a good thing for you to practice this when it comes to the MCAT, because the more you practice this, the closer these lines become and the closer their relatedness. And so that way, when you remember one thing, you suddenly can remember a lot more connections. Okay, so that was it on these 3 ways that it's represented. So we've talked a lot about encoding, storage, and now we're going to talk about the last part of the information processing theory, which is retrieval. So aka getting things out of memory or recall. There's 3 main ways that you have to remember, that the 3 main ways of retrieval that you got to remember. And I've organized them from the easiest to the most difficult. The easiest of ways of getting something out of memory is through recognition. Recognition is an example of it is multiple choice question. A multiple choice question is one that's right here. That's asking, when repeating a phone number over and over to herself, a test subject is using what function of memory storage system? So recognition in this case is me giving you 4 options and not asking you to say what the right answer is without it. Oh, we have some votes. All righty. Any other thoughts? All righty. So I've gotten some answers, and a lot of you are right for that one. A is not the right answer. And B is not the right answer. D is not the right answer. C is the right answer. Can anybody tell me why A is not the right answer? A is not the right answer. Yes, thank you, Alexandra. Right, right, exactly, because of the chunk, right, exactly. If we were looking at something where we could, from the question, understand that it was items that this person had to remember, unlike a phone number, then maybe A would be relevant. The episodic buffer interfacing with the long-term memory is a really great answer choice I wrote that sounds really nice and means nothing. It's just a very MCAT style one of just like trying to throw you off by putting in terms that are real. The episodic buffer does interface with long-term memory. But what the scenario here is doing is not trying to put something in long-term memory. It's just an example of the phonological loop with maintenance rehearsal. Clustering the numbers into related groups is like saying chunking in another term. The only reason why D is not the correct answer is because what the test subject is doing is repeating a phone number. Repeating a phone number, that act is maintenance rehearsal with a phonological loop. If it wasn't repeating a phone number and say the test subject is trying to remember a number by organizing it in a specific way, such that it's easier to remember, then clustering the number into related groups would be the right answer. The key thing here in this question is the repeating the phone number, which is the rehearsal. And because it's a phone number, it's a phonological aspect. I quite like that question. The next one is cued recall, and that one is becoming a little bit more difficult, but it's not too bad. Cued recall is the one in which we give you cues in order to remember something, retrieval cues specifically. And there's some examples to it. The context cues, this is what happens when you lose your keys and you walk and you're like, oh shit, let me go back. And then you're walking, where did I leave my keys? And you retrace your steps. You go to the context of where you might find the context of the original thing that it is that you're trying to remember, aka recall. The other one is filling in the blanks, and that one is something that we see in this example. If I ask you what this is, and you're not looking at the slides, the PDF, most of you hopefully should be like, oh my God, I have no idea what that is. Unless you're just like really good at remembering. Okay, yeah. So I got an answer that it's a derivative of cholesterol. That's good. I mean, it's got 4 rings. But if I tell you this, could you tell me what this compound is named? Yeah, so testosterone. All you needed was the T, really. I don't think I needed even to put the own part to it. So this is an example of fill in the blank. Pretty straightforward. Oh, and mood. Mood is a good one. So what if you are trying to also help your recall with some cues, it's helpful to be in the same mood in which you encoded the information. This is why it's so important for you to study in a good, happy mental state, because you want to replicate that at all times and try to replicate relaxation during the actual test as much as you can, so that you're in the same mood that can function actually as a cue to recall some of the memory. The last one, and the most difficult of them, is the free recall, which means that there's no cues for you to do. And this is just basically me saying, please write an essay of 16 pages comparing and contrasting bottom-up and top-down processes. The thing about free recall is that it's you can recall information in any order you'd like. There's no specification for it. But it is the most difficult one to do because you have no cues to help you get the information out of the long-term memory so that you can work with it. So there's a couple of factors that are influencing recall. And the most important one that you need to know is the serial position effect. And this one is the one in which there was a series of tests done in which people were asked to remember a list of names. There's so many different forms of this test, but like a list of objects. And they found that people were more likely to remember the objects at the beginning of the list and at the end of the list. It creates a curve called the serial position curve, which is something you don't need to memorize, but it's something that you might recognize it in a problem set. And the primacy effect is just saying that this is the effect of remembering the things that are at the beginning of this. And then the recency effect is the ones remembering the things at the end of the list. This is a super, super important thing for you to know. Like I can't stress enough that you need to know primacy effect and recency effect. And in general, the serial position effect. It's really straightforward, actually. It's just the fact that one of the factors that helps us retrieve is, especially when it comes to a list of items, it just helps where along the list the objects are, or the items are. Another one is the context dependence of memory. And this is the one that shows up when we were just talking about context cues. So the context cue is like actually the cue itself is like the physical like space of like, okay, I'm gonna go to the place where I normally put the keys. The context dependence memory is just a greater process, like a more umbrella process of it. And it explains a couple of interesting phenomena when it comes to testing. The first thing it explains is that it's really important for you to do your practice tests in an environment that mimics the type of environment you're going to have in the testing center. How many of you know that? Everybody has to say yes. Everybody should be preparing for full-length tests in which they take the breaks at the times that they would, they take the pauses at the time they would run to the bathroom during the breaks, and they would give themselves about 5 minutes to recognize that they have to check in and check out of the testing center for peeing. You gotta do that. And the reason you gotta do it is because of context dependent memory. This particular effect shows that retrieval of memories is much better when we do things in the context in which we're trying to remember it. It also explains, interestingly, why it's also a good idea to do studying in different environments all the time. And the reason because of that is because we cannot mimic the testing environment exactly unless you have like some hookup that's allowing you to like go take the full length at the Pearson's testing centers. You cannot replicate it fully. So it is really good for you to do as much as you can the testing environments, but it's also important for you to do studying, perhaps not the full length, but the studying in various different environments, like coffee shops, like libraries, like your kitchen, like so many different areas, because that way you are strengthening different types of contexts for remembering things. This actually becomes really helpful when it comes to testing in new environments because it increases your flexibility in doing that. So I hope that makes sense. The last one you need to know for this one is state-dependent memory. And the easiest way to remember this one is that if you study drunk, you have to take the test drunk, period. There's no other way around it. Oh, shoot. So you study drunk, you gotta take the MCAT drunk. This graph tells you why. Because the state in which you are, this is also related to mood cues, if you're trying to retrieve something, it's best if you are in that same state. My suggestion, instead of being drunk when you're studying, is to actually be more in a mental, happy, relaxed state of mind, because being drunk also will, by itself, will just diminish your performance and things, even though your confidence will increase. And this diagram shows some particular study seeing that people who studied sober perform better sober, and people who study drunk perform better while being drunk. Notice that the drunk part, the bars are lower for both. So the performance does go down anyways. The testing effect is kind of what it sounds like, which is this is a factor that helps retrieving by just testing stuff. The more you test it, it helps your recall. This has to in part to do with a lot of the spreading activation that we were talking about previously, in that you're trying to get different ways of getting something to associate with other memories. And the stronger the associations, the quicker and more accurate things come out of memory. So test, test, test. And priming. Priming is one of the ways that you can also influence recall. There's two types of priming. One is positive and one is negative. Positive and negative don't mean that one's happy and one's sad. It just means that positive helps spreading activation and helps the recall, and negative affects it. It does the opposite. It turns it off and makes it worse than if you didn't have any priming at all. That's all you got to know about positive and negative priming, but just know that it's nothing to do with the state of it. It's just positive enhances and negative affects the recall. Negative is something that I remember seeing in a question set that was actually employed by cognitive behavioral therapists when they actually wanted to negatively prime people who had PTSD to not recall something quite as vividly and quickly. So that's one example in which one might want to use negative priming. I have a question with you. Right. If I understand the question I got correctly, the more spreading activation we have, or rather the more rehearsal we have of spreading activation of a specific spot, then the links become closer, which means that the recall becomes quicker and more accurate. I hope that answered the question. So retrieval, the last part I have to say about retrieval is some distortions to memory. So memory, like I said with Rose and how she got some things wrong about, the Titanic and all that, is that her mental representation of memory is not a video recording. None of ours, in fact. And this is shown in the misinformation effect. And this is seen in this example over here, in which participants were made to watch a video in which there was a collision. And then they walked away, and then days later they came back, and there was a question asking, did you see, oh no, excuse me, when they were first watching the video the first time, a group was asked how fast were they going when they hit each other, and the other group was asked how fast were they going when they smashed into each other. Some days passed, and then they met with the groups, and then they ended up asking them, was there broken glass? Not surprisingly, the people who were first asked to think about the experience as smashing said that they actually saw glass. There was no glass in the video. But in the case of people who were told about you could think about it in terms of priming, we're thinking of like when the cars simply hit each other, a less percentage of people said that were glass. This is a misinformation effect, and it happens all the time. And this is a form in which our recall is distorted. And you can see from this example that there's something to do with priming that also influences that. So this is the thing that takes us to deja vu that Jonathan was talking about, which is not only that we have distortions because of priming, but we also just have unreliable retrieval processes. The first thing to understand is what reality monitoring is, which is just our cognitive questioning of what did happen in a memory. So this is just as an example, is like, did I take that pill or did I just intend to take it? And then that's just the reality monitoring that the phenomena, or I guess the mental process that you need to know. Source monitoring is definitely very important. Right. Did I close the garage door? I know that one. I always think about this. I was going to write the stove example because I always think about, did I turn off the stove? But I don't want to write that one because that one goes into, it ventures into obsessive compulsive tendencies, which is something we'll talk about later. So I don't want to confuse the concepts. But yes, I like those examples, Brooke. Exactly. So source monitoring is something you definitely need to know, which is when you're contemplating where the memory came from. So reality monitoring is just, did it happen? Yes or no. But source monitoring is like, where did it come from? And this is where deja vu comes into play, because everything about the memory of something is like, oh, I've experienced this, but where? So that's something that shows up for source monitoring. Source monitoring errors come up all the time. And a thing for source monitoring that could take an example would be something like, did I read that in the New York Times or the Rolling Stone? And you could see afterwards you made this error by saying, oh, it was totally the New York Times, where in fact it was neither of them. It was a psychology textbook that you read it. And so this particular slide has the source monitoring error. I think that's the one that you really have to take away from this, which is that memories retrieval is just, can be just wrong in the process of retrieving them. And it can be because we cannot remember the sources for them accurately. So how fast do we forget things? This is a very depressing diagram for people studying the MCAT, because it shows the forgetting curve. That in this case, the subject was trying to remember a series of nonsense syllables, meaning just things that didn't make sense, just a sequence of letters. And we can see that after memorizing them, meaning like the subject tested himself over and over and over, and he memorized them and then took breaks. At 20-minute mark, his correct retrieval was 60%. And then at 60-minute, it went down to 50%. Yeah, I know. It's awful. It's awful. And then it goes down and down. And it's just like, why do I even bother to create flashcards if this is going to happen? Here's the part that you need to recognize. It plateaus, baby. It plateaus. It's like that 5-10, it plateaus. And that's a real thing that we're seeing here with the forgetting curve. Retention plateaus at a certain place, so that you can see that testing 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 31 days, there's not that dramatic difference between 9 hours and 31 days. So Jonathan has the right idea. Don't stress too much about it, because you don't forget everything according to the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You can increase this, however, by studying more. So that when you drop to the 60%, or let's say you drop to the 55% in 60 minutes, you pick it back up in the study. And so then you take up the study one more time, and you are in essence increasing the curve each time. It feels like it, Monica, because it's science. It's true. It turns out that the Ebbinghaus curve, I will give you some some things that will make you feel better. This particular curve is testing something that has nothing associated with meaning or personal representation, as we saw in retrieval cues. So this was meaningless sequences of letters. So this is what we're seeing now. Curves that account for things where like you're doing something with motivation or with meaning or with personal connection, the curves are far less steeper. So fall in love with amino acids as best as you can, and the curve will be less steep. Okay, so we're gonna move on to among the last parts of the sections. I'm hustling as fast as I can, and I think we're nearly there. And this is forgetting. So this part is really important that that doesn't happen to you. But it will happen in some aspects of your life, and that's a good thing. We got to remember that forgetting is actually really useful, because if we remembered every absolute thing that we ever experienced, then we probably would have a very hard time leaving our house for fear of actually remembering one more thing. Forgetting is actually something that's considered an adaptive development. And so as such, it's seen as a process that isn't so much the villain, but we just try to study it in terms of why it happens. So one of the ways that forgetting is studied is retention. So like how much of something is retained, and what's not retained is obviously what's forgotten. And it can be, forgetting could be studied through recall, recognition, and relearning. So the relearning part is what I want you to take away from this slide, as well as saving scores. I want you to take this away because you might see this in a passage that's talking about getting memory back and from forgetting into your memory again. And one of the ways is relearning, and it's measured with saving scores. So saving scores is pretty simple once you understand it, but let me try to give you a really simple example. If I give you a list of 10 plants, and let's say you forgot 5 of them, according to Ebbinghaus, after 20 minutes, or 2 minutes actually. And then I gave you 5 and you remember 5. So you relearn them. And then I test you again and see how many you remember. And you remembered 7 instead of 5 this time. Your saving score meant that you saved 2 items on that list. Does that make sense? You went from remembering 5 to remembering 7. So you saved the effort of having to remember, you saved the effort of having to relearn 2 more items. And now you have to relearn 3 items, and so on and so forth. So that's what saving scores means. You can think about it as it's how much relearning are you saving in a score. And then one of the reasons why we forget is, right. Yeah, I mean, this whole section is like telling you why things are designed in certain ways when it comes to teaching. Exactly, Matilda. Why we forget is perhaps because of ineffective encoding. So this is actually going back to the first things we were talking about in this section, which was encoding, like getting things into memory to begin with. One of them is that we just never got it very well to begin with. And so that can also be called pseudo forgetting. Like we think we actually encoded the memory, but we didn't actually do a very good job of it. So it's not really forgetting, it's pseudo forgetting. I can ask you an example of this because, and this one you can't cheat by looking ahead unless you cheat it by looking in your wallet. But can anybody tell me what an actual penny looks like? Ninth one? Which one's ninth? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The one with 1 cent on the bottom? Yeah, I would have picked that one too. 10. I know that the last four ones are janky. That's for sure, not a penny. But five, yeah, no, yeah, you're all wrong. And I won't tell you which one it is. You can look it up. But this is exactly no, no, grab a wallet and find out. Um, but this is exactly a demonstration of no, I found out because I didn't know, Tiffany, but then I Googled it. Uh, but this is the thing. This is probably an example of pseudo forgetting. You actually probably never really encoded what a penny truly looks like. So what is one of the mechanisms of this? Is just because you didn't pay that much attention to it. And that's a good thing, right? We don't have to pay attention to like absolutely every detail unless we were coin collectors. In that case, we would want to use attention if that's something that mattered to us. But in the case of not having attention, then that could lead to ineffective encoding. And no, Jonathan, one of them is right. The other reason why we forget is decay. So we talked about decay in the sense of short-term memory. Remember how we talked about the different time periods of sensory memory and short-term memory? So here's the concept of decay again, but this is a decay in the sense of long-term memory. So we didn't talk about that. We said that memory was indefinite in long-term memory. So Sophie, you're right. Yeah, you went through the hassle. That's right. Sophie was right. The proposition of decay is that memory fades over time. So it's saying that actually it might be kind of like sensory and short-term memories, that it's not infinite in its timeline. But the thing is that we see, in fact, that decay is pretty tricky, and that's why we, for the MCAT, won't put a time period to it, that something actually decays from long-term memory. The reason why we don't want to put a time period to it is because so many different studies show that things that we do think we have forgotten end up actually still being there. One of the ways that I can attest to it is because I thought I forgot psychology. after I took the MCAT, I was like, it's gone, it's done. But it's not the case. It's still there. So decay might be a process in it, but we're not going to tag a time to it because then we don't have any scientific evidence for that. The most important thing for you to remember about these reasons why we forget is this one, which is interference. And it's so easy to confuse these two. Interference is an effect of when a memory blocks remembering of another memory. It's that simple. It's one memory interfering with another. There's two types. There's retroactive and proactive interference. This diagram shows really clearly which is which. In the case of retroactive on the top, you're trying to remember a concept for an economics test that you studied previously in the blue, but you came up with a concept in psychology, and that's the one that blocks the memory of the economy concept for your economics test. In the proactive interference, you have the same test in econ, and you just recently studied a topic in economics, yet an old memory of psychology is blocking that one. So it's really important because you're gonna get a question about this, I promise you. And it's also really easy for you to confuse which is which. The way that I like to remember it is that I think of retro as old and pro as new. And so the retro is blocked in retroactive interference. So you want to remember the old, but it's blocked. And what's doing the blocking is the new. In proactive interference, the pro is blocked. And that's the one in which the old memory is blocking the new one. Does that make sense? I hope that way of remembering makes sense to you. It's a very easy concept to forget, or not forget, but confuse. All right, so we're close to the end, folks. So we're going to talk about a little bit of the brain, and just a little bit, because memory in the brain is really quite complicated. And you don't need to know nearly that much for the MCAT in terms of the brain. Everything we've spoken about so far is just concepts that we've observed in the field of psychology and come up with theories around them. Some of these gain more and more support because we're starting to see stuff in the brain. The only example so far we've talked about that was with neglect syndrome, where we saw injuries in the parietal lobe, showed us what we saw in those diagrams, which ended up proving that that we pay attention to objects as well as the space within objects are. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the circuitry and anatomy of memory. So memory consists of neural circuits. That much we can say for sure. So we're not going to say that the things that we spoke about, the modal model where we had little boxes, we're not going to say that the brain is subdivided into boxes where there's like neurons in one and neurons in the other. That's just the model. But we can say that there are neural circuits. And there's support for this because of long-term potentiation, which is a physiological thing. It means that there's a strengthening between the connections of neurons due to repeated activity. One of the ways that you strengthen neurons is by just getting more of their little dendrites to synapse with other presynaptic neurons. So if you can imagine a neuron, one way that it's strengthened is by having its little dendrites, kind of like hair, spreading out even farther and making more connections with more neurons. Long-term potentiation has nothing to do with neurogenesis. Neurogenesis means the creating of new neurons. And that's not what's happening here. This is with the existing neurons that exist. You're just strengthening the connections that they have. If this makes you think of spreading activation, there's a reason why those two concepts are very much connected. And long-term potentiation would... I just got a question, if you could elaborate what that means. Okay. A question is asking, in terms of a particular disorder where certain pathways are stuck or not stuck. Was there anything? Yeah. I think there's, in particular disorders such as OCD, there is a problem, and same thing with addiction. There is a problem of why it's so difficult to revert these disorders because of the fact of long-term potentiation, meaning that there's a strengthening in pathways that are actually aberrant, meaning that they're not healthy for the body, and it's hard to go back because of repetition, exactly. This is also why in long-term potentiation, a form of long-term potentiation, I should be careful about stretching this too far, because long-term potentiation has a lot to do with what we'll talk about in memory, but it's also present in the form of habits, which is a milder form of disorders, which is like, if you have the habit for the last 5 years of like your phone alarm goes off and the first thing you do is go to Instagram, you are strengthening pathways that allow you to do that more and more without thinking. And it becomes more difficult to revert them. So if you think about certain things you want to change, also have the conscious awareness that part of why it's difficult to change habits is because of neuronal connections that are strengthened in ways that we don't want them to be strengthened. And it's really tough to go the other way around. Of course, there's other ways to go around by like decay of neurons, but that's not what we want. We want just neural pathways to chill out and not be as strong. In the case of memory, though, for long-term potentiation, if you're thinking of spreading activation, these are really two subjects that go hand in hand. Remember, spreading activation was when we're thinking about the fire engine and there were connected concepts in a circuit. Well, in the case of long-term potentiation, this is also seen, but in the case of neurons. So don't confuse the two. We're talking about a neuron here, like a little slimy cell in the brain. And spreading activation is a concept, not connected to any specific neuron, but they are very interrelated. Amnesia is a type of memory loss due to head injury. So here's another head injury, but in this case, instead of affecting selective attention, it's affecting memory. And there's two types that you gotta know for amnesia. One is retrograde amnesia, and the other one is anterograde amnesia. The best way to look at it is by just getting this diagram into memory, which is showing you that there's an event in time, which is the onset of amnesia by way of an accident. Retrograde amnesia is the one that prevents you from remembering memories from, here's my dog, preventing memories from the past of that object, of that incident. And the anterograde amnesia is the one in which you cannot remember memories after the incident. What's that really corny movie? The one where they have a million dates for the first time ever because somebody can't remember. Thank you, Marissa. Exactly. I think so. I think you're right. Right, Groundhog Day. So these are examples of amnesia. This is definitely going to come up in your studies of it. I'm not sure if it's like a super hot topic for the MCAT, but it's really good for you to know the difference between the two of them. The last thing I want to say here about the anatomy is that the anatomical store, oh, there's a typo, that should be anatomical store of the of where memory is something that's actually called the medial temporal lobe memory system. This is not one specific place in your brain that stores memory. So it's so very easy for you to think that the hippocampus is like the place where memory is stored, but that's actually not really the case. We see evidence that memory can be stored in this entire system as it's played out in this diagram. This diagram is a gorgeous one, and I recommend that you screenshot it and then just like stare at it before you go to sleep. And then when you wake up, instead of Instagram, look at this. And notice that the hippocampus is a really important part to it, but this is important for consolidation of the memories of it. So that's one of the things to think about in terms of the hippocampus. The other ones are also important for you to know, but don't stress too much about memorizing them very, very specifically. I would say just the hippocampus is for memory consolidation. And just so that I'm clear about consolidation, it's what I mean by consolidation is the process in which you take memory from the encoding part into like the long-term memory. So that interface we were talking about between the episodic buffer and the long-term memory. All right. The last parts I want to talk to you about are the different types of memory. And this is, again, another hierarchical diagram. And it's pretty straightforward. We divide memory into declarative and procedural memory. So those are the first ones that you can see on the top of there. The declarative memory is also called explicit memory. And it's important for you to know that, that those are interchangeable terms. And non-declarative memory can also be called implicit memory or procedural memory. So all those three terms, you gotta know them. Oh, my computer's gonna die. The declarative memory aspect of it is something effortful that you're trying to recall something from. So declarative memory is something like factual information. So that's something that requires, oh, I'm sorry, I phrased that as a question. I was supposed to ask you that. It's effortful. And then the non-declarative memory, can you tell me if it's effortful? Or let me tell you first what it is. It's actions such as riding a bike or walking, um, or conditioned reflexes like with babies. Yeah, effortless. Or emotional memories. Emotional memories would be classified as flashbulb memories. Uh, so those are effortless, correct. Um, there's differences in the retention of them. The ones in the declarative memory systems are more easy to um, yeah, that's right. So the ones in the declarative memory are more vulnerable to getting forgotten. That makes sense, right? Because if the factual information is, say, trying to remember which of the 20 amino acids you got to know is oh shit, uh they're all S except for one is R, right? Or are they all R except for one is S? They're all S, right? They're all S and one is R. That's what I was thinking. Exactly, that cysteine was the outlier, is the R. See, okay, so that's a perfect example right now of how vulnerable declarative memory is to forgetting. So that's a fact that I struggle to remember. So whereas the non-declarative or implicit or procedural, as it's also called, is effortless. So those are things like riding a bicycle. And also those are the ones that if you haven't done something in a while, you find that relearning it is actually quite easy. There's also differences in the brain region for them. The declarative memory falls under the medial temporal system we were just talking about in the previous slide. But then the non-declarative memory falls in the cerebellum and the amygdala specifically. This makes sense if you think about your neuroanatomy lectures where cerebellum's activity, at least for the purposes of the MCAT, you have to think about it in terms of basic motor functions, right? And not so basic too, but motor functions. And the amygdala makes sense because if you think about flashbulb memories being emotionally charged, the amygdala is a place that is centered on a lot of drama of our life. So that makes sense why those two would be distinct. The second to last distinction is semantic versus episodic memory, and that's going to be the subdivision of declarative memory. Semantic memory is just, they're both factual memories, but semantic is the one that is general knowledge. And there's no particular date tagged to it. You can think of this as a sort of encyclopedia of just a fact, whereas episodic memory does have a tag of when. And I like to think about this as autobiographical or time travel because it's a memory of particular events in your life. This is not to be confused with a flashbulb memory because that's an emotional one and that's a non-declarative memory. So keep that straight. So even though flashbulb memories are episodes in your life, it's not episodic memory. The last type of memory is prospective and retrospective memory. And these are the ones in which, as you can see, this lady, she's thinking retrospectively and trying to remember something that occurred, or thinking prospectively and remembering actions in the future. That's one that we don't think about that much, but it's just as important as retroactive. Remembering a prospective memory is just remembering that after this lecture, you have to have breakfast. But that's not that hard to think. Whereas a retrospective one is one in the past. I mean, in my case, a breakfast is Jonathan. Are episodic memories more accurate than? Oh, just got a question about if episodic memories are more accurate than flashbulb memories. I don't know if I can answer whether one is more accurate than the other. I can definitely say that they're both subject to the same types of problems and why memories can become inaccurate over time. And that was the end of memory. And yet again, a little long. um, and I'm definitely happy to stick around as long as you'd like. But I want to do a quick recap of some stuff that we've talked so far. So the stuff that we talked about last week, or last time that we met, was sensory and perception, and we didn't talk about some of the sensory pathways that are highlighted in blue, and we didn't talk about some of the systems over there. Of those, I think that you really, if you haven't, excuse me, if you haven't encountered them yet in your own study, they're really not that hard. Somatosensation and smell and all these ones are not very complicated. My suggestion would be if if you can take the time, please prioritize, I should say, the kinesthetic and the vestibular sense. They're connected to the ear because of the otolith organ. So just anatomically, they're physically connected. And I think that one might serve you well to study, to prioritize that one. I literally think that taste is honestly like you taste salt, sweet, acid, bitter, and umami. Like honestly, and maybe like some of the mechanisms of like salt is like sodium chloride, stuff like that. Somatosensation is interesting, and you should definitely know it, and it's tied into the sensory receptors. But the thing to take away from somatosensation more than anything is pain, which is a pretty quick one, but it's also very interesting. Then there's, for this content category, as detailed by the MCAT content, today we went over this section, but we didn't talk about the items that are highlighted in blue, believe it or not, because what we talked about, even though attention is only selected and divided, it's actually quite detailed. And in my opinion, the two that we talked about are definitely going to show up. The ones that you should prioritize from the stuff in blue, I would say would be language. Unfortunately, it's not very long. Language is very complicated, but for the purposes of the MCAT, it's not going to ask you very much. You should definitely know more about the brain regions that work with language, as well as a couple of different theories when it comes to the development of language. And in parentheses, they give you learning, nativist, and interactionist. And basically, those are the three you need to know. Cognition is something that I would definitely love to talk more about with you at a later point. We talked about the information processing model, but other than that, we didn't speak about the rest of the things in cognition. And Piaget's stages of cognitive development, for some reason, they just love cognitive development stages, will show up in the MCAT. So I urge you to prioritize learning Piaget stages. And then some of the problem solving and decision-making problems of cognition is something I definitely recommend you work on. Consciousness is probably my favorite of this whole list. And unfortunately, I'm so sad I couldn't talk to you about it, but it's also one that isn't tested that much. So that's why I didn't talk to about this one, even though it's my favorite one to talk about. You need to know the stages of sleep for the section of consciousness, and it's super easy to remember. And just recognize the names that go along with the EEG patterns. And then there's some part to do with addiction and drugs that affect consciousness. And those are pretty straightforward to remember too. So I would love to talk more about these at a different time in office hours. Perhaps during office hours, next time I can make a poll, and then we can find a topic that most people want to talk about. Otherwise, in one-on-ones, we could do that. And to you that made it to the end, this one's fun. So kick back.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir. I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away. It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
And action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Alrighty. This is a commercial for I think cyclists, actually. For drivers to attend cyclists. Yeah. Look at we're cyclists. Lady Smythe. Gosh, who would have guessed? I hope you liked that video. And hopefully it also illustrated that thing we were talking about, selective attention. And I like that way more than the awkward one that is the classic psychology experiment. So I've gotten a number of questions about phase one homeworks and stuff like that. Oh my God, everybody's so eager to do more study, which is great. So for this particular section, there is the corresponding subjects would be found on section 3 of the book, starting on page 156. And you, with what we talked today, you are able. Yeah, I got a question about the TBR books versus Khan Academy versus UWorld. And I can definitely answer that. But let me just, on the TBR side, you should be able to answer this, the freestanding questions except for a few of them that involve decision-making stuff. And then in terms of the passages, here's my thought about this section with the passages. If I have to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the questions associated with the passages for this section. That being said, if you were going to consider a phase 1, I would suggest passages 1, 2, and 4 are your phase 1 questions for this one. 1, 2, and 4. I'm not a big fan of the questions for this one in particular because I think they're asking things that are not as likely to get asked. For the most part, on the MCAT, I think they're going into specifics of the theories and in the brain, places where these theories might be related to in ways that are a little too specific for the MCAT. And I think the MCAT would instead phrase them in a more generalized way. In general, my thought, not only for this section, but for all of the questions in the psychology book for TBR, I think that they can be not a true reading of where you're at with your progress of the psychology stuff, just because I think it takes it a little bit too in like the psychology framing of it. I will say, however, that I think it's a good idea for you to read these passages. So this is something you may have not heard of before, but you would really benefit from taking the time to read the passage and understand them, because these passages are very good in that, like the MCAT, they're just very boring and very confusing. they have graphs, and they just are packed with a lot of detail. So you would do really well to read all the passages, to highlight and to test yourself in like your understanding of a passage in constrained time intervals. So I don't know if any of you have tried that, but when it comes to psychology and sociology, one of our biggest downfalls is that we're just not used to the passages that we have to read. I feel like we're even more used to cars, oddly enough, than we are used to reading psychological and sociological findings. So my advice is read these, test yourself for your understanding of them, and do some of the associated questions of it. But I would suggest when it comes to this section and section 3, as far as I've noticed, if you are noticing that you're getting a lot of them wrong, I don't think that should tell you that that's where your understanding is at. Now, with the cognizance that I'm with TBR right now, I don't want to be tooting horns too much of different resources out there. But one of the resources that we do connect you to is Khan Academy. And Khan Academy is definitely a really good place to go to practice psych and social concepts. They're probably the most comprehensive in terms of everything that you are ever gonna see in terms of that. In terms of reading the text for psych, my suggestion would be that you go over the text after the lecture and not before it. Reading the text for psychology is a little different than reading the text for the other books. If you haven't been introduced to the material, my opinion is that this text is not very good at introducing you to the material for the first time because it's jam-packed with the concepts. So what I try to do with these lectures is, instead of packing you everything you will ever hear, I try to parse them out so that you kind of understand it a little bit better. This is at the expense, obviously, that I can't cover everything. But my suggestion is, now that we've done this lecture, is for you to go back to section 2 for the sections of attention and memory and see if there's something in there that you don't understand, that is something that we covered. And I think that will be more helpful to tell you what is a gap that you still have in your understanding. And let me see if I've answered all the questions regarding phase 1. And obviously phase 2 would be that you take the next 3 passages and the next 3 passages. My suggestion is that you should start with 1, 2, and 4, because I think those are the ones that cover what we talked about today. I have a question about going back to talking about the late selection theory. And the late selection theory, yeah, I'd be happy to go back there. Back to selective attention. I didn't give an example of the late selection theory. I don't think. And I should try to come up with an example. One thing that I wrote down as a potential example is something of subliminal perception, but I don't want to go into that because I can't explain that too much. I think I'll do better by next time getting an example of it, because I think that's a really good handy thing to have. Because we talked about early selection being the dichotic listening task where you couldn't hear anything in the unattended ear. And then we saw with the attenuating model that it was that dichotic listening task, but with the stories where you mesh the two. But I didn't give you an example with the late selection. So I'll get a really good example for that for next time, and I'll share that with everybody because that would definitely help solidify between the three. And how's everybody doing with the psych stuff? Have you been practicing? Have you been doing questions? Flashcards mostly, Marissa? Are you making your own flashcards or are you using a deck that's pre-made? Which one? I don't know Aiden. I don't know who she is. Okay, TBR. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. That, yeah, if it's working for you, good. Good. That's great. Especially because we're a small group, it gives me a little bit more freedom to talk about things that aren't too TBR. But Marissa, I don't mean to, if Aiden's your gal, you stick to her. But if you're looking to mingle with other people, who are you? I think it's what is this called? This is, so there's Mild Down. Okay. So there's Mild Down has a very oh shoot. Okay, Mild Down has a very iconic excuse me, what's it called? Anki deck that's based off of the Khan Academy videos, and it's a very good one for general stuff. But there's this one that is crazy. This one is got like 1,000 slides for Psych-Soc, and it has everything you'd ever need to know. I need to see the name so I can recognize it. Pre-med 95. I think that's the one. So if y'all are in the market for pre-made decks, pre-made 95 is or is it Q-Bean? Check either of these out. Sorry, I don't have this at hand. I haven't looked at them in a minute. Okay, so between pre-med 95, or Q-Bean, which I think Q-Bean is pre-med 95 but made better, if I'm not mistaken. I think Q-Bean's the one you want to look at because I think Q-Bean took out the Psych-Soc stuff out of pre-med 95 and made it like a monster truck of Psych-Soc. And it's one that covers Psych-Soc in an insane amount of cards. I think it's like It's definitely like over 1,000 cards. So it depends on how much time you have. But if you have more time, you could do the Cubine one. It's tricky to do that many when you also have to do so many of the other ones. So bear that in mind. But the nice thing about the Cubine or Pre-Med 95 is that when you download the deck, it's subdivided into different things. So you don't necessarily have to do all 1,000. It's not one deck. You can grab the thing. And I can't remember if it's based off of Khan Academy or not. My sense is that it's not based off of Khan Academy because Pre-Med 95 and Cubine does a really cool thing where they organize the decks according to the content categories in the AAMC MCAT catalog. They don't organize it according to anybody else. They organize it. So kind of like how I've been following like 6A and 6B, that kind of stuff. That's what they do. They're not following any text or something like that. Again, beware. It's better to be realistic and not chew off too much and like get yourself like a million cards and say like, okay, I'm gonna do them all every day for 1 hour. It's you gotta be strategic. But obviously the best way to do it is if you could do your own cards. Let's be real, it's hard to do your own cards and everything else at the same time. So totally understandable if you do pre-made cards. Pre-made cards are arguably not gonna like be as effective in terms of remembering it fast enough, but with repetition, it will work. They definitely will work because of rehearsal. And Anki uses exactly the concepts of memory, which is like spacing and stuff like that, which is everything you want to do. Any other questions? Alrighty. If there are no other questions, folks, thank you for sticking around. You are. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you all for sticking around. And then if you ever need to talk about any particular questions, just email me and we can set up a time for sure. But until next time, take care, everybody, and happy studying.